comfortably zoned with the Zigzag Man in Alameda, California, pushing on the doors of life marked pull and fighting the unholy trinity as we go. Big business, organized religion, and government. I'm back. You are flying high with me, the Zigzag Man, from Alameda, California. We're flying high over the zone, comfortably zoned radio network production. Now, I fulfilled all my obligation to the FCC. You know where we're coming from. Same old place, Alameda, California, down by the lagoon, where it is always a little pungent. And we're celebrating our 4th year doing podcast radio. And to help me celebrate, I'd like to bring on my guest, an award-winning columnist from the San Jose Mercury News in Northern California, Mark Purdy. How are you, sir?
I'm at the top of my game, Ralph. I'm sorry I didn't realize this was an anniversary show. I would have brought a cake. I did not.
Well, I brought the kike.
Okay.
I don't know where that's coming from.
I don't know where that's coming from.
We used to have a thing in the Air Force, the Jew, the kike, and the wop, and we'd all have little, someone left the kike out in the rain, said Max Litkey 50 years ago. That was
I guess
me.
I wasn't there. I wasn't there.
No, you weren't, but I am, and I am a survivor of the Vietnam era.
Oh,
so,
okay. I'm a survivor of Catholic school, so
yeah,
it's not quite the same thing. I'm more impressed.
Absolutely, it's damaging. You never get over it, but you learn some lessons, and that you'll never forget. I can assure you of that. Nice to really have you, because I'm an admirer of anybody who's won a Pulitzer Prize, as you have. You guys covered the 1989 earthquake fiasco, actually, at Candlestick Park, and that you won it as a group. But
right. Yeah, so let's not push that. You know, like my line is always, I won 1/300th of a Pulitzer Prize, right? Because that was a great Pulitzer Prize to win, because it went to everybody on our staff, and everybody played a part in that, and I'm glad they gave it to the whole staff. It was a great teamwork effort, and obviously something I'll never forget, and nobody in the Bay Area that was here will ever forget the earthquake, but the fact that our paper was able to really assist the Bay Area in figuring out what happened and what the damage really was, the sad stories, the heartwarming stories, and my little piece of it was, the earthquake, the Candlestick Park and the aftermath of that, and the whole how baseball dealt with the aftermath of that. So I mean, I don't want to dismiss it. I'm really proud of the work I did on that, but it was a shared award. And it was something that at the end of my career I'll definitely cherish.
Well, you could cherish it right now and stop being all that modest. This is not
okay.
Good.
No, but
let's go on from there. You also you were going to name it originally the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network Cove, but you named it the McCovey Cove. You decided on that at the last moment. That's something you'll be remembered for. But what I'd like to know is what led you, how do you feel about McCovey? I mean, in a way that that led you to name it after him. What was it about him, his courageousness? I know what he's coming back from, so his knee problems later in life. But what were your dealings with him? How did you become intimate with him?
Yeah. Well, let me tell the whole story as quickly as possible. The idea came to me when, as the ballpark, the new ballpark, now known as AT&T Park, was being constructed. And I was up there in San Francisco for another reason, actually, with my kid going to the X Games, of all things. And we rode by where the ballpark was being constructed, and I had known that they were planning to build a statue of Willie Mays behind home plate, and the place was going to be called, and the address of the ballpark was going to be Willie Mays Plaza, 24 Willie Mays Plaza. And also I knew that there was, this pre-opening hype that the batters were going to be able to hit balls into the bay. And so I was going by there, and I said, well, wow, they really, the way the ballpark's constructed, not really going to hit the balls into the bay. They're going to hit into this channel of water going by the right field, which is then known as China Basin Channel, not a real glamorous name. And so I just kind of made mental notes like, well, I'm going to be, of course, scrupulous accurate and not say they're hitting the balls in the bay. They're going to hit into China Basin Cove. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. They're doing something to honor Willie Mays. And the next day, I just happened to be at Candlestick Park covering a game where the Giants were then playing, and was just kind of ruminating over this and going like, what are they doing to honor McCovey, who I think, everyone agrees Willie Mays was probably the greatest Giants player, but I think you can make an argument, especially in the Bay Area, San Francisco, that McCovey was a more popular player. And I kept thinking about it. I kept thinking, and if he were playing in that new ballpark with his, left-handed power, he would be launching balls into that water. And I just kind of put two and two together in my head and was sitting in the dining room with a guy you may know of, a guy named Leonard Coppett. He's now not with us. And we were having this discussion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good friend
of
mine.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm having lunch with him. Yes, he worked for the New York Times, and then at that point, I think he was working for the Palo Alto paper and was doing freelance stuff. And he was at the ballpark a lot. A great gentleman, great baseball fan as well. And so I was talking about this, and I said, they ought to do something to honor McCovey. And Leonard, I was driving by the other day. They ought to what do you think of this idea? He was the first guy I ran it by. I said, what do you think of this idea? They should put McCovey's name on that water, and then they can honor McCovey at one part of the ballpark and Mays at the other, and they could call that McCovey. And so we just kind of sat there, and I said we could call it, I don't know, McCovey River, McCovey's Lake, and we were throwing names back and forth, and finally one of us said McCovey Cove, because of the alliteration.
Right.
And so I didn't have a better column idea that day, frankly. So I said, here's what ought to happen. We ought to think of, this is what they ought to do. And I ran it by Larry Baer, who was now he's a big shot, but he was somewhat a big shot then with the Giants. And I said, listen, this is what I'm going to write. What do you think? He goes like, that's interesting. Well, that's all I got was that's interesting. So I did what every obnoxious newspaper columnist does. I wrote it again and said, look, this is really what they ought to do. But I wanted to do that second column after kind of running it by Willie McCovey himself, because you never know. I mean, I've dealt with all kinds of players, and look, his name is, that's his name, and I didn't want to do something that he didn't want to do. I figured he would be okay with it, but you never know. I wasn't sure, if he had you never know with guys. You never know with guys.
Sure.
You're right. You just don't know. I mean, maybe he would have not liked it for some reason. Maybe he was upset, about something. Who knows? But anyway, so I set up. I reached him by phone, and we set up a lunch. And I had talked to him a little in other occasions, not a lot before then. But and he said, I said, look, so I have this idea, and I really want to push it, but I want to know how you feel about it. And he said, he couldn't have been more gracious and said, this is really nice, and I've never really shared everything about that conversation, but I can tell you that at that point, McCovey felt kind of estranged from the Giants organization. He had gone through some tax problems, and he had some injuries, and he kind of wondered if the Giants organization even wanted him around anymore, because he had not been invited to certain things that he maybe had been in the past, and so I thought, well, that's really too bad that he feels that way. So I came out with an even stronger column about.
All right.
This is what we need to do. This is what needs to happen. And at that point, I ran it by Larry Berry, and I said, I'm going to write this again. I really think this is something you guys ought to do. And he said, you know what? I think we might do that. And of course I said, I think you should do that. And so when the ballpark was built, they agreed to do that. City of San Francisco agreed to go along with that, and they put a little plaque up on the wall there. And even better, they built a statue of McCovey out there across the water on that point across from the ballpark, and they had a ceremony, and they officially named it McCovey Cove. And one of my proudest possessions, I have a picture of Willie and I kind of above the cove looking down, over that. And I can just tell you over the years, we are not we're not close friends or anything. But he's always been very, very great about giving me credit for the idea, which he does not have to do. It's his cove. It's not about me at all. And somewhere along the way, Ralph, I also had this, as I was going through this process, I also had this realization, because I could see how things were going, not just with the Giants, but with baseball. I said, if we don't name this McCovey Cove, you can sure as hell bet it's going to be Taco Bell Cove or Burger King Cove or something like that, right? Yeah. And so my idea, and when I wrote those columns was, the way I presented it was, this great giant needs to be recognized, but also, if he were playing, he would be hitting balls into that cove. And the reason we do this stuff is so that when a father or mother takes a kid to a ballpark and they start talking about Willie Mays Plaza or McCovey Cove, and the kid asks, why is it called McCovey Cove? So that the parent can then explain, well, let me tell you about Willie McCovey, let me tell you what he did. Let me tell you about, all those home runs he hit, and he's probably the greatest, he's the greatest left-handed hitting home run hitter, certainly in Giants history. And maybe even, you can make a case in baseball history. But, and so that conversation starts because somebody's name is on that piece of water, or Willie Mays' name is on the plaza. Because, guys my age and your age, we just kind of assume every kid knows who Willie Mays and Willie McCovey is. So, a lot of them don't. But those sorts of things start the conversation, and so it makes me happy that if those conversations are happening, and it makes me really happy because after that occurred, the Giants did bring McCovey back into the fold for a lot of the reasons they should have, and he is at the ballpark a lot. His health is not awesome, but he rides around in a cart at the park, and I see him from time to time, and we just have, very brief conversations. But it just makes me happy. It makes me happy those conversations are happening, and makes me happy.
You have a lifetime connect with the Hall of Fame guy who's a gentleman and really, as you say, the true hero in San Francisco. Because when they came out here, Willie had already been a star. San Francisco had a hard time accepting the former New Yorker, and McCovey was Cepeda too. They were homegrown.
Right. He came up, he played his first major league game at Seal Stadium. Right. He was, and also, let's be honest, he a very more approachable guy personality-wise than Mays. Mays has always been prickly. I don't know if I would use that word exactly, but he's unpredictable. I don't think he's a bad guy. I just think every day when you approach him, you just never know quite what you're going to get. You might get like, see you later, or you might get, well, what do you want to talk about? You just never know with him. And McCovey is invariably gracious to everyone he meets.
He's warmth. And Cepeda is too. I wish Cepeda didn't go through what he went through with that marijuana thing years ago.
Yeah, really, but it happened, and I don't think he was the only guy to do. But it's good to see.
I'm the king of it all. I mean for his sake, in the community that he was in. it's a very conservative community, the baseball itself, and I think it set him back, just public relations wise.
Well, it also kept him out of the Hall of Fame for a while, I think.
Right.
Yeah, but it all rectified itself, and he does really good work in the community stuff he does now.
Oh, absolutely.
But
he's cha-cha.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
I got to ask you, because you went to school in the Midwest. Did you grow up there?
Yeah, I grew up in a really small town in Ohio, Salina, Ohio, the name of the town, right on the Ohio-Indiana border, and went to college in Chicago.
Journalist to become a sports columnist, or a journalist and then become a sports columnist?
Thank you for asking that question. The short answer is I was interested in, the great Red Smith, certainly one of the best 4 or 5 sports writers ever, and a guy really lucky as a young man to sit next to him at certain events. He always said, and I remember reading this at a young age, to be a good sports writer or a good sports journalist, it's far more important for you to be a fan of journalism than a fan of sports. And I was a fan of journalism before I was a fan of sports. My dad had 3 newspapers delivered to the house in this little town in Ohio, and he was a judge and later an attorney and a practicing attorney, and he just devoured the news, and we talked about it. So I was a fan of newspapers, and then of course I played sports as a kid, and my senior year in high school, true story. I was like the backup quarterback on the football team behind a guy who was going to get a Division I scholarship and did, and I also wrote for the school newspaper, and the sports editor of my hometown paper said, "Purdy, I've seen you play, I've seen you write. You write a lot better than you play. And if you quit the team and come work for me on Friday nights covering high school games instead of going and sitting on the bench, I'll pay you $15 a story." Right? This is 1969. So that was a quick decision because gas was 30-some cents a gallon, if you remember. Yeah. And so that's how I started writing about sports, and then went to school at Northwestern University, got involved with the school newspaper there. And they said, "What have you done?" I said, "Well, for my hometown paper, I write sports." "Great, we need a sports writer." So that's how I started writing sports in college. And then in those days, newspapers came to interview for internships and stuff at schools. They said, "What have you done?" I said, "Well, I've done sports." They said, "Oh, great, we want you to sports." But so I kind of fell into sports that way. But for the school newspaper, I did write other stuff. I remember the 72 presidential election. They assigned me to cover the Richard Nixon victory party in downtown Chicago at the Republican headquarters, which I had fun writing about. And I'm really but yeah, well,
these are the Abby Hoffman days.
Yeah. So on my campus, they're shutting down they shut down the main road through campus, for the Vietnam War protests and everything.
Right.
But meanwhile, but looking back, maybe that was the demarcation point, because one of those springs, I forget what was happening in Vietnam, but there was a campus shutdown, and they shut down the main road through campus at Northwestern. It's called Sheridan Road, and they were burning bonfires on there. And somebody came to my dorm room and said, "So, Purdy, you want to go to the Revolution tonight, or do you want to go to the White Sox game?" And I said, I think I'd like to go to the White Sox game. So maybe that was the real demarcation point in my life. I don't know. But I am proud of this. At various stages in my career, at the different places I've worked, and including the Mercury News, I've written other stuff. I've written for the editorial page. I've written for the food section. I've written for the entertainment section. I've written for the front page. I've written for we used to have a Sunday magazine about different topics other than sports. But
what would that topic
this is a long answer to your question, which is I consider myself a journalist first and a sports journalist second, and
gotcha.
And that's just the way I try to approach it.
And if it weren't sports, what would be the main thing you'd be writing about?
Wow. If if I could have anything, probably politics, maybe, or entertainment. I'm a big music fan, and films and theater too, but mainly music. I played in a.
Who'd you grow up listening to music-wise?
Well, in this little town in Ohio, it was, initially when I was a kid, British Invasion, rock and roll, and then garage rock, right? When we were growing up in the late '60s, and two of the great garage rock groups were from here in San Jose, where I live now, and it's been a kick to get to know these guys. Count Five, who had a song called "Psychotic Reaction," and the Syndicate of Sound, Hey Little Girl was one that was there. Both of them were like one-hit wonders out of garages here in San Jose. But the band that was from my home area was a band called the McCoys, who had a hit called "Hang On Sloopy." And then, and you remember that?
Yeah, 1965, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. So I would have been like 14 years old or something, and then got into college and just those Bob Dylan and the band and all that good stuff. I'm pretty eclectic. I like good old-fashioned country songs, and I like soul music too. But I feel fortunate, if we're talking about music, to have grown up there in like that '60s, early '70s, where there really was a mix and the genres were kind of swirled together. And you could listen to a radio station, and the same radio station would play, James Brown and the Rolling Stones, or play the Isley Brothers and Elton John. That doesn't seem to happen anymore.
And I'm a few years before you, and I enjoyed the crossovers. When a Ray Charles could cross over from country to pop to R&B, and it was just a different era where things weren't as specialized, where you go to a radio station and get almost anything, an eclectic playlist, as opposed to today, where you turn on a station and it's one or the other. And
they've got it segmented even more so, like there's adult easy listening, and then there's all these different, there's dance music, there's emo music, there's Americana. It's all broken down into these little micro granular categories that I don't understand the point of that. Good music's good music.
You're in the print media, and it's at best a walk in a fine line these days. Has the San Jose paper gone to the internet as well? Are they one of the last holdouts? What's the story?
I think the best way to describe it is we're earnestly pursuing a way to keep written journalism meaningful in the Bay Area. I think that's the best way to put it. And yes, we've had we've been through. There've been a lot of changes. The Mercury News is now part of a bigger operation called the Bay Area News Group, which is in turn run by an operation called Digital First out of Denver, which is in turn owned by a hedge fund out of New York City. So by the time those things trickle down to us, I'm not quite sure how the decision process works, but where we stand right now is we put out a daily newspaper product, recently consolidated, used to be 7 or 8 papers under that Bay Area News Group umbrella. Now we consolidated just 2, the Mercury News, which is the South Bay and the Peninsula, and the East Bay Times in the East Bay, which is now the imprimatur of the former Contra Costa Times, Oakland Tribune, Alameda, Times-Star, Hayward Review, Fremont Argus. That's now all put together in the East Bay Times. Now online,
it's a big advantage for you because you're getting your name out there where you hadn't before.
I guess so. I mean, Ralph, I've never been one that. I mean, I do what I do, and Yeah, it's great to have as many people as possible. But I'm not, my mission isn't to have. It's a weird part of my job. I mean, I really love my job, but my mission isn't so that when I go to a Starbucks in Alameda or Walnut Creek, that people go like, "Oh, you're Mark Purdy. You do this." I mean, that's always flattering and great when it happens. But I try to do my work, and people can consume it or not consume it. I hope they at least sample it. But in terms of where we are, so we have these two print products now, basically, one in the East Bay, one in the South Bay, and we are also online at. I want to be up to date. So certainly mercurynews.com, and I think eastbaytimes.com now, maybe, or certainly I know InsideBayArea.com, and all of those, all the content from all those papers can be found there. We're also reaching out with some initiatives with video and podcasts and stuff, all under that online site. The idea is to keep people's eyeballs and hope provide interesting stuff for them to use their eyeballs.
Could you give me and my audience an insight as to, because you're talking about new ownership, and how much does the ownership control editorial policies? In other words, say, I'm speaking in general, not just in say a Murdoch-owned paper. On a day-to-day basis, that they're owned by Murdoch, how much does that affect the paper's editorial policies and what gets actually printed? The bottom line, is the owner that affect that much on what we read as listeners, subscribers?
Yeah. Well, I am not an authority on the entire newspaper business. I know the way it works at our place, and of course I have friends that work at other places. And the answer to your question is, it depends. The owner is the owner. The owner can do whatever he or she wants to do. Journalism protocol usually is that the owner hires a publisher who runs the business operation and hires the editorial people, and if the editorial people like to be given free rein to do what they want. In some places, that those reins are a little tighter than others. And I know at our place, nobody from the hedge fund in New York tells our editorial writers what to write, and certainly nobody tells me what I should write. But if they wanted to, they could, and I can't say at other places they don't. I don't know for sure. But where it does affect it, and the best answer to your question is budget, and that allows in terms of how much space we have in terms of the pages, how big the paper's going to be, how the commitment they're going to give to hire people to cover certain things. As I approach my retirement years, I'm not there yet. My concern is that because our staff, which used to be between 300 and 400 people, is now down to under 100. The stories we're missing, because the hedge fund, as is their right, wants to keep a certain budget, but that has called for diminished staff, and so there are stories that people are not getting because we don't have as many people as we used to, and some of those stories are important stories. And just today, right now, I'm looking at the front page of my paper, and this business that's going on at Berkeley of sexual harassment cases. We're the people that put in a Freedom of Information request to see exactly what's going on there and unearth that, wow, there's more than just a few. There's a series of them. And I noticed on that story there are like 4 bylines. So it took 4 people to get that done. And I'm glad we made the commitment to do it. But if I don't know what we're not doing, because we only have a fourth of the staff we did. And that's the biggest effect an ownership has. 3 or 4
other equally important issues going on
that we are not getting to. Yes. Yes,
Right.
and that's the biggest effect an owner has. In sports, it affects us in terms of what we can go cover and all that, but I've never believed sports is as important as a lot of other stuff. Try to have fun with it, and I know people like reading about it, and I try to.
It's the candy. It's the candy store of life.
Well, it's a lot of things.
Should
It's a lot of things. It's a lot of things. It's a window. I believe. Yeah, the joke is it's a toy store of the newspaper, and that's in a lot of respects true. But also, it's kind of a window into society, and a window into a region's personality. I think sports teams in the Bay Area are part
of life.
Well, that's another cliche, but I do think you go to each region, Ralph.
I got a million of them.
and you see what people care about, in terms of sports. That's kind of a window into that region's personality and that region's mojo, and I think that's
beautiful. Well, you were in Cincinnati, then you can address Pete Rose with that in mind. With how does the way Cincinnati addresses Pete Rose, as opposed to the rest of the country, what windows that give us into Cincinnati and what's going on there?
Yeah, good question. Yes, I was in Cincinnati, and I interacted with Pete Rose a lot. Was at his house once, and that was an interesting story that it takes a little while to tell, but basically,
go ahead.
He was open. Well, okay, real quick, because
doesn't have to be quick.
No. I got about 10 more minutes here, so I'll tell this real quick. Yeah, he had Pete, as you remember, played for the Reds. Then he left there. They let him go, and so Pete grew up on the west side of Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, there's a west side and east side. West side's the hard scrabble, blue collar side of town. East side is where the more college educated and executives kind of live. And so Pete had grown up on the west side. And when he left the Reds, his marriage fell apart, and this is when he went to Philadelphia. He fell in love with the Philadelphia Eagles cheerleader, married her, but he wanted to stay in Cincinnati, but he had always lived on the west side of town. So now he marries this cheerleader from Philadelphia, and he buys a house in a eastern suburb called Indian Hill, really like the fanciest suburb. So I ran into Pete. I guess I must have been covering up. Maybe the Phillies were in town or something, and I said, "Hey, I heard you moved to the east side. What's up with that?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, a nice house." I said, "Can I come out and see it?" He goes, "Yeah, sure." And so the next morning I went out there with a photographer. And he was real proud, because there was a big interest in Cincinnati in this. It's that kind of town. Like, are you a West Sider or East Sider? And the funny story about that, real quick, was so we're going through this nice house, modern house in this beautiful eastern suburb, and he's got big screen TVs in every room. This is very unusual. This would have been the early '80s, and in the kitchen, in the dining room, and in the bathroom, he's got a TV in there. And I'm going like, Pete, what's this about? He goes like, well, I got a satellite dish out back. I'm a big sports fan, and when I come home, I like to watch sports, and this allows me to go to room. I can have the game on in all the rooms, and I get a lot of, sometimes when I make an appearance, they don't pay me with money, they pay me with merchandise, and usually, I get all these TVs, and some people give them away or sell them. I just keep them all and hook them all up to the dish. Well, later on, of course, I realized, the reason that was happening was because he was betting on all those games, right?
Right.
Right? I didn't know, I was dumb at the time and didn't hook, connect all the dots.
Who would make that connection?
Yeah, and the other thing that happened that day, I remember, so as I'm leaving the house, and I said, Pete, look, I got to ask you this question. This has been great. Thank you for having me out here and showing me around. But your wife, your ex-wife, has just announced she's going to write a book, and it's going to be a tell-all book, and she's going to tell about all the bad stuff you did. And I'm not interested in people's personal lives in the job I do, but I do think it's a fair question to ask. Is that going to be a distraction to you at all? Do you think that's going to be, something that affects you, at the ballpark or whatever? I kind of knew the answer, but his answer was, Oh, hell no. He goes, like, everybody knows I cheated on her and, all the bad stuff I did around town. That's only going to affect our kids, and I wish she wouldn't write it because, I'll own up to all the crap I did, and nobody's going to be surprised if she writes I was sleeping around. But, think about how it's going to affect our kids. Well, that turned out to be the lead of my column, right? Because he was so anyway, but I think in answer to your question, the attitude of people from Cincinnati about Pete is like, oh, that's just Pete. He's kind of a knucklehead. He was a great ball player, but he's our guy, right? He grew up here. He's our guy, and I don't know who would compare in an earlier age to an alley like that, but and people in Cincinnati are provincial in that, if you're our guy, you're our guy, and yeah, he's our rogue and a scalawag and all that, but he's our guy. And there are a number of people in Cincinnati who think that, it was really bad, the stuff he did. I don't know anybody thinks it was great, but I think there's just kind of that attitude in Cincinnati about, he bet on his team, but
the
he's our guy.
Was worse, like with everything else, with Nixon and with Reagan. The cover-up is worse than anything. And I wish,
at the time, looking back now, it's kind of gross. So then, right in the middle of that, I end up taking the job out here, Ralph, at San Jose. So then, if you remember, while the investigation was going on, for a while, Pete was still managing the Reds. The Reds come out here, and I'm not close with Pete or anything, but Pete was just kind of an open book to everybody, right? At least in the media, which is why a lot of people were initially, I think, willing to, give him a break on some of this. I was just, so the Reds come out here, and I remember sitting in the dugout at Candlestick Park while all this investigation was going on, and Pete turns to me and goes like, well, what do you think I should do? And I said, Pete, you're asking me? I said, here's what I want. I want to know, what happened, and I want to know that, the worst stuff I hear isn't true, and I want to know, what, how and why and all this happened. I just, and he says, yeah, well, my lawyers are telling me I shouldn't say anything. And I said, okay, well, you got to listen to your lawyers, but I really hope, I said, I really hope the worst of this stuff isn't true, Pete. I really hope. And he said, yeah, and he just kind of nodded. So do I think he should be in the Hall of Fame? He's certainly a Hall of Famer. I mean, but I vote for the Hall of Fame, and he's not on the ballot, so I can't vote for him, right? It's an interesting issue.
Bonds is on the ballot. You vote for him, I hope.
No, I don't vote for him. I don't vote for him, and I don't vote for him or the Star guys, not because any necessarily any moral issue, but in this sense that I want to know what I was watching back then. I'm supposed to judge these guys, and I still don't think we know enough about that era to know what we're seeing. And the fact, and I want to know I sat through every minute of that Bonds perjury trial, and they brought in a lot of ball players into that courtroom and said a lot of interesting things, much of which didn't make it into the general media because there was so much of it and it was kind of mundane. But they brought in like Marvin Bernard, who talks about smuggling in steroids from Mexico, and then Bonds' trainer telling him, don't use those, use my stuff, I'll meet you in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven. And then in comes the Giambi brothers, and they're telling these stories, and Randy Velarde, and I'm thinking like, was everybody in steroids at that time? And if so, then that puts a different cast on it, right? There's a 10-year window in which you can vote for Hall of Famers. And I know at the end of those 10 years we'll know more about what we were seeing. Now, I think there should be an amnesty where everybody is allowed to tell exactly what happened. I mean, if 80% of the people were using this stuff, then that changes my way. But maybe the way I look at it. But right now, when I see these guys' numbers, I always think of like, what about the pitchers that Bonds was going against that weren't using steroids? And maybe if Bonds and these other guys were not using steroids, those pitchers might have been able to accumulate enough achievements to make the Hall of Fame themselves, but instead we're cheated out of that because these guys were doing that.
How many of the pitchers were on steroids, Clemens?
Well, I want to know that too. Yeah, I want to. I don't vote for Clemens either. I think there's big questions about him. So it's look, they ask us to vote for this. I do. I pick up the ballot every year and do the best I can in making those choices. I'm not saying there aren't other arguments than the ones I make,
right.
but that's just the way I approach it. And I have my friends in Cincinnati who think, well, you ought to write in Pete Rose's name anyway. And well, Pete just can't get out of his own way. That's basically it. This latest thing, he tried to kind of make an attempt to come clean, but in the meantime, he's just opened a place in Las Vegas where he bets on games. So what are you going to do?
What are you going to do? I want you to answer one question for me. Your outstanding article, which you'll take to the grave, and which you only take 1/300th credit for, about the earthquake. Is there anything you wish you would have put in that article, and is there anything you wish you would have left out?
Wow. No one's ever asked me that question, and in our business, we're always thinking about the next thing. What I got to write. I'm thinking about what I got to write today, not what I wrote yesterday, right?
Well, this is make it.
And you know what?
Really
here's my honest answer. First of all, you always look at something you've written and know it could have been better, but you're on a deadline, you got to chunk it out. So I'm sure if I looked at that, I would say, yeah, I kind of wish. But I'm very comfortable in this. I mean, what I wrote was honest at the time. It was honest at the time about all that and how it was a series of columns really over those. Because we won the Pulitzer for the coverage of like that whole week or two of it, and so I wrote a couple, 3 columns in there. One, questioning whether the series should go on, and I remember having this very intense conversation with Tony La Russa, where I said, they ought to think about just canceling this thing. I mean, they still haven't pulled. Maybe you remember there were bodies still in the collapsed freeway. How can you play baseball when they still don't have all these bodies pulled out here, and people were suffering in certain parts of the Bay Area, and what do they and we don't need the police to have to worry about a World Series too while all this is going on. And Tony, who was the manager of the A's, said, look, I understand what you're saying, but if we get to a point where things are reasonably recovered, and then you can convince me that it's going to hurt anybody to play the World Series, then I might agree with you that it should be canceled. But I really think it could help more than hurt. And so like the initial column was about the night of that, the night, what happened that night, and all that, and just the emotions at the ballpark. And I remember Giants players in their uniforms getting into their cars in the parking lot while still dressed in their uniforms with their families to try to get home, and just what and a car, police, a police cruiser with a bullhorn, get everybody get out, the power's out, everybody's got to leave, and then going into like, holy cow, what happened, and do we really want to keep this going? Do we really want to keep this World Series going, or would it be better just to have a permanent asterisk on this World Series so people remember what happened here? To, all right, well, here's what the baseball commissioner says, and so then I remember writing an emotional column for me about, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to start the World Series again, this is how it ought to be done to honor the people who died here, and also people who have tried to, and this is what we ought to do. So I'm sure I could go back and say, yeah, maybe I would have worded stuff differently, but I feel my retrospect about that, just sitting here talking to you, is I feel good that I was honest in writing that. I wasn't doing it to like try to provoke anything or get reaction, or which I won't kid you, sometimes you do that. I mean, that was a series of very honest columns that fit into our really excellent coverage of all the other aspects of it. And you were asking about sports being the toy department. That time the World Series was part of that whole mix of that earthquake period that you know, people who were enduring that and going through that, you know, it was part of their lives as they were experiencing that whole, you know, first the quake and then the immediate recovery aftermath. I mean, I guess if I had to go back, maybe I didn't stress enough. Just think about that, Ralph. I mean, that whole summer, you know, both teams, the A's and the Giants, were playing great baseball, and we all knew, you know, there was a chance they could play in the World Series, but it was leading to something. And holy cow, it really happens for the first and only, so far only time that's ever happened. First time and only time it's ever happened. And they play, you know, they play the World Series, and here we are at the ballpark for the first and only time that these two teams are playing each other in this ballpark that's you know, considered dumpy and crappy. And the earthquake hits exactly at that time, with the full load. You know, I do remember writing about that part. Just the full load of people, and you know, the maximum amount of weight that Candlestick Park structure could hold. You know, think of just the cosmic thing that had to happen for those two teams to win, and then for games scheduled at that time, and then a quake to hit right at that time.
Hey, you know what would
maybe I wasn't incredulous enough about
if those heaters would have come on just at that time.
Well, I'm just glad it came. You know, when people ask me, "What's your favorite ballpark?"
They never worked once.
No, they never. You know, no. Melvin Bell, I won a lawsuit because of it. But when people ask me my favorite ballpark, I always say Candlestick Park. You know, and they say, "What?" I say, "Well, it was a piece of crap, and it was awful, and it was horrible to go to games there. But you know what? On the night when it had maximum load and the largest earthquake of my lifetime hit, Candlestick Park held together. Candlestick Park held together, and that is why it'll always be my favorite."
Yeah, well, I saw more games at Candlestick. I grew up in New York, came out here in my 20s, and spent the rest of my life out here. Saw more games at Candlestick than all of the others combined, and it had a
survived.
It
survived.
Right.
It
like all
certainly
of us.
was unique. It certainly was unique. You know.
And sometimes surviving is a good thing for all of us.
Yeah. Something else sports teaches us. Hey, I'm going to have to split. It's been great.
Thank you, sir.
I really appreciate
it. I hope you'll come back sometime. And it's a real pleasure.
Sure. No, it was a lot of fun. And I appreciate anybody taking any time to read what I have to say. And you know, anybody. My last part of this, I always say I'm an equal opportunity columnist. I steal ideas from anybody. So if anybody has an idea for a column, my email is at the bottom of my column, and you can certainly find me on Twitter or Facebook, as you did, I believe. So
I did indeed. I've been listening to you on KNBR for so long, and I think we were talking about Joe Dimagio. You were talking about Joe Dimagio, and I Twittered you and told you that Joe Dimagio is a coach for the A's under Finley to get his pension, as a matter of fact. And did you get a chance to meet him at all?
Yeah, real quick. You know, he was friends with a guy named Jack Allen who owned a restaurant here in San Jose. So he would come down and have lunch there maybe once every 6 weeks, 2 months. And one time I got invited to one of those lunches, and it was, you know, Jack would invite, I don't know, a couple, 3 other guys, kind of rotating through. But the best conversation I had with him once was purely by chance. I was at Candlestick Park, and I was writing a column that day about Will Clark and his swing. Will Clark had, as you remember, you know, just had this beautiful, great left-handed fluid swing.
Sweet swing.
Just beautiful. And so somebody says, "Hey, Dimagio's here today." I said, "Really? Where?" And they said, "He's back in Murph's office." Well, Mike Murphy is a longtime Giants equipment manager, and his office was kind of when it was just kind of unofficial when any of the old ball players would come to the ballpark. They just kind of sit there and shoot the bull with whoever it was. I remember going in there once, and there's 6 Hall of Famers in there, right? Frank Robinson is there. And, well, this day it was just Dimagio, and he was back there, Murph. And so I walked in. I said, Joe, we met once or twice at lunch. And yeah, and he kind of looked up dubiously because he didn't like to do interviews. And I said, listen, I'm writing this column today about Will Clark's swing, and so you're here today. I just thought I'd take advantage if you have any thoughts about that, and how would you compare it to like Williams, Ted Williams' swing, or where do you think that is it like Williams' swing at all, or any other swing? And he goes like, oh no, that's nothing like Williams' swing. Here's why. Boom! I opened my notebook, and for the next 5-10 minutes, he's dissecting Will Clark's swing. Saying it doesn't compare to Williams, but I can't remember who he compared it to, and here's why it works, and blah 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 blah. And I'm going, thank you, and made for great addition to my column. It probably was my whole column that day, just what Dimagio thinks of Will Clark's swing, and thanked him afterwards, and but it made me regret that Joe wasn't more of a public guy that way. That may be what sparked your email to me or whatever about I don't know, I forget what it was that I was writing about Dimagio that you sent that to me, but
I just
I regret is that Joe's personality wasn't such that he would have been such a great resource storyteller for journalists and as a conduit to the baseball fans, right? I mean, he had a lot to add, but he chose to be, you're allowed to be. He chose to be a private person. But closing up my notebook that day, I remember wow, this guy, he has so much knowledge, and that was so interesting what he had to say. It's too bad he doesn't do that more often, and I was just lucky today, and that he happened to be here and was in the mood to talk about it.
Well, that's just how I feel about you.
Well, God bless you.
All right.
Listen, I'm going to have to split. I got a column to write.
All right.
But, maybe we can do this again sometime.
You can write about podcast radio if you'd like.
All right. Okay. There's an idea.
All right.
All right. Hey, hope you enjoy the baseball season. Hope you enjoy the baseball season and everybody.
Thank you, sir. Great morning. I really enjoy your company.
It was really fun, Ralph. Thank you.
All
do
right.
it again.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is the old Zigzag Man about to tell you to keep on keeping on.